Welcome and thank you all for standing by. All participants will be on a listen-only mode for the duration of today's conference. I'd like to inform parties that the call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. And then I'll turn the meeting over to Mr. Brian Beams. Thank you, sir. You may begin.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Beams. I am your host for today's webinar. I'm a Senior International Trade Specialist with the U.S. Commercial Service. My office is located in northern New Jersey. With us today is my colleague, Anthony Sargis. Anthony is also a Senior International Trade Specialist, and he is located at the U.S. Commercial Service office in Connecticut. On behalf of the U.S. Commercial Service and in partnership with the Connecticut District Export Council, we welcome all of you to today's webinar titled USMCA Qualifying Your Goods, which is part one of our two-part webinar series. A couple of items to note before we get started. Be sure you are connected using both your telephone and the online WebEx platform, which enables you to view the presentation. All telephone lines are muted for the entirety of today's webinar. The recordings and presentation will be sent to you by Thursday, 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Finally, our web address has changed. Please note that all U.S. commercial service information can now be found on www.trade.gov. Again, that's www.trade.gov. I'd like to take a moment to inform those who are new to the U.S. Commercial Service. We are the trade and investment arm of the U.S. federal government, a division of the International Trade Administration. Our mission is to promote U.S. interests, promote U.S. exports, protect U.S. interests abroad, and facilitate foreign direct investment into the United States. We have offices all around the world. Domestically, we have over 100. Internationally, our offices are located within the U.S. embassies and consulates in over 75 countries. This is a slide on our second part of our two-part webinar under the USMCA. Note, it is this Wednesday. Will take place at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Final note, we will not be offering a Q&A session for part one of this webinar series. However, we will offer an extended Q&A session during part two, at which time you may ask questions from either session. Now I'd like to take a moment to introduce today's speakers. First up is Jim Trubitz. Jim has over 30 years of experience in compliance consulting and supply chain management. He is a regular speaker for international trade groups, including the Buffalo World Trade Association, where he serves as a board member. He is endorsed by the National Association of Small Business International Trade Educators as a certified global business professional. Jim graduated from SUNY Buffalo and went on to complete the executive program in supply chain management at Lowry A. He completed the International Air Transport Association's Air Cargo Training Program, and Jim is a licensed customs broker, a certified customs specialist, and a director of business development for Mohawk Global Logistics. Our second speaker is Jay Charco. Jay is the president of the International Tariff Management. He earned a bachelor's of chemical engineering from Syracuse University. He has an MBA from the University of Hartford. Jay is a licensed customs house broker. Before co-founding ITM in 1982, he had a diverse career with Uniroyal, where he held various senior management positions. Jay is well-versed in the intricacies of the duty drawback regulation and also many foreign trade agreements. He has lectured on tariff management issues at industry conferences and corporate meetings. He is an active member of both the American Association of Exporters and Importers and the National Customs Brokers and Forwarders Association of America. Without further ado, I welcome Jim Trubitz. Jim?
Brian, thank you so much. But we're going to talk about the USMCA and what is also known as CUSMA and TMEC. Hard to believe we're a month out on this agreement. And from the emails that I'm seeing from clients, importers and exporters alike, there's so many questions and so much that needs to be addressed. So today we're going to talk about the rules of origin and how to help you qualify your goods. And then in Part 2, we're going to look at how to ensure that your USMCA declarations meet those new requirements. We'll discuss the importance of reviewing for accuracy and maintaining your documentation, because that's a key thing going forward. The one thing that's very important is that we're now in a situation where there's still changes being made to the USMCA. And so give you an example. There's a glitch where if you don't have your documentation correct initially, when you're going to go and submit your entry, you would have to pay the duty and then have to recover it. There's a glitch right now in the 520D right now where it doesn't allow you to recover the MPF on imports into the U.S. So this is something they're trying to work through. But as an importer or an exporter, you need to ensure your goods are qualified and properly documented. So we're going to look at what's important. So let's look at some of the things that are new. These are really important. So some of these are high-level things, and we're just going to be able to just touch on them briefly. So we have higher de minimis levels now for Canada and Mexico. So what do I mean by that? If you have courier shipments going to Canada now, under the old regulations, you were allowed $20 duty-free or tax-free before your goods would have to be where you'd have to make entry. Now, under this new agreement, they have it for courier shipments going into Canada from the U.S. or Mexico. You have now $150 for duty-free or $40 for taxes. If anybody's interested in knowing more about this, there's a customs notice on the CBSA website, and it's 20-18. So this will be something that if you want to review further, we can talk about it further. But for the length of time we have today, we have to kind of cover these just at a high level. One of the biggest takeaways under the USMCA was free trade claims can now be certified by the importer. Up to this point, it was always the exporter in Canada that would be allowed to make that declaration. But now it can be actually certified by the importer, the producer, or the exporter. The other thing that was really interesting is the regional value content rules were updated for various commodities. So we'll have more on this, but I think the important takeaway from this is that you need to review these rules because there was quite a few changes. Transshipment rules have been enhanced or slightly modified. So in the past, if you sent something to another country and it was returned, they would not allow you to return it under the free trade agreement. If the goods are now remain in customs custody in that other country, short of being maybe unloaded out of a container and reloaded into another one, then they're now going to allow that under the transshipment rules to qualify under the USMCA. They modified the rules for sets, and we'll look at that slightly, and then we're going to talk about recovered goods, chemical rules, and automotive, plus we'll talk about de minimis. But with articles such as textiles and automotive, we're not going to cover today. Those are a special session on their own. But here's kind of an interesting one. So the NAFTA agreement really didn't have a carve-out for recovered goods. This came in future free trade agreements where you would see it, like Korea had a similar carve-out for recovered goods. And a lot of these free trade agreements had these. It now allows you to qualify your goods is remanufactured. So many industries rebuild cores and remanufacture them, and now under this agreement, they're actually recognized as a form of production. This is a big, big change. So it's going to encourage trade and production for remanufactured goods in the United States. And ultimately, this is what it's about. It's to create jobs in the North American countries. We also have 8 individual chemical rules, and where the formulations were lobbied by the industry to help qualify chemicals in Chapter 4, Section 6. They still have to qualify under a tariff shift rule or an RVC, but these rules of origin give a menu of options to help you document your origin. And again, they were created to help increase production in North America. So de minimis is pretty exciting because we went from 7% under NAFTA to 10% under USMCA. So this is going to allow for greater foreign content, but still allow you to qualify your goods. So the USMCA actually has some advantages, and it's going to increase the impact of using foreign materials as long as they're de minimis or trivial, where they're 10% or less. However, that being said, if you're doing an RVC calculation, you can't deduct the 10% from the RVC. One of the things that's going to be great is Jay's got a really unique real-life example coming up on the impact of the USMCA versus NAFTA.
This is my turn, I think, now.
You got it, sir.
Thank you, Jim. It's a very strange situation because the certificate of origin, the USMCA form, is not prescribed by anybody. They list a bunch of minimum data elements, which are in Annex 5A, which we'll talk about in quite a bit of detail in Phase 2 of this presentation. But for purposes now, we'll just mention them. The interesting thing about the certification, to me, who's been doing this for a while, is that the importer can certify the goods that they meet the origin criteria. And the producer or the exporter must provide that importer with this information because the importer has absolutely no idea that these things qualify. So we're going to get into that in quite a bit of detail as we get through some examples here and also as we get into Phase 2. But there's no rejects for minor errors. The NAFTA had some rejection of the certificates, and you can make now a timely correction. The very interesting part about this certificate is that which again we'll get into in a little bit more detail, but is the importer must be in possession of the document before they can make importation. And the other thing that's interesting is the electronic format, thing of the time, is now acceptable to have your data in that kind of a format.
So Jay and I are going to tag team this slide, and for good reason. I know it says when in doubt, talk it out. Always consult with an expert. There's many experts named under reasonable care for an exporter and importer to go to. Customs being one of them, consultants being another one, licensed customs brokers. But more important, this is not really a shameless plug at all, because as 20% of the rules of origin have changed, you want to make sure you're linking, you're looking at this very carefully. You need to research CBP's interim implementing instructions. One of the reasons why is it states right here, an importer will not be subject to penalties under 19 U.S.C. 1592 for making an incorrect claim that a good qualifies under the U.S. originating good if the importer, in accordance with the regulations described by the Secretary, makes a corrected declaration within 30 days and pays any duties or MPF owed. Throughout that interim document, there's quite a bit of talk about reasonable care, and in Canada they call it due diligence.
An interesting thing about this is that this is a very difficult process. There are 270 pages of rules, and the average person doesn't have the background or the history to go through all those things. It's extremely important that once a document is created, that it's right, because as we all know, once it goes into your files, it continues to stay in your files year after year after year. And at one point, there might be an audit, and people change, and nobody's going to be able to go back and find out exactly who created this document and what documentation is required behind it. So we can't emphasize enough that in the first pass, this is a brand new agreement that you must, if you have questions, ask them. There's websites, there are consultants, there's the government, there's a lot of people out there that can help you with this, but it's impossible to go ahead blindly and start filling out these documents because they have serious repercussions down the road.
Thanks, Jay. Great point.
The 4 conditions to claim USMCA viability is obviously, number 1, the goods must qualify. You can't put on a certificate that the goods qualify if they don't qualify. Even if they do qualify, they must ship from a USMCA country. The declarations must be properly completed. You can't have this declaration, which the format hasn't been determined yet, but the data elements are, you cannot leave out any of the information. And most importantly, the importer must possess the information to support the declaration at the time of the claim. This we will get into in quite a bit of detail in this webinar and also in the next one, because the proper calculation of the region of value content or tariff shifts is a very important element in qualifying goods to be shipped with the proper conditions.
So where do you find those rules of origin? You're going to find those in Chapter 4. One of the things that's interesting here is you're going to see a reference to General Note 11 in the U.S. Harmonized Tariff Schedule, the U.S. General Note 11 does not have any content at this point. It's soon to be published. We promise to get it out to everybody that's on this webinar today. We'll send you the link. However, we don't have particulars on the general note at this point. But we will keep you up to date. So just like NAFTA, we have our ABCs again. This time, they've actually shrunk the number of alpha categories that you can qualify your goods under. And, so obviously, we're going to go into great detail on these, but look at, you got your ABCs. A, wholly obtained or produced in the territory. B, meeting the Annex 4B rules of origin. Those are those specific rules tied to your tariff number. As Jay likes to refer to it, this is the meat of the agreement. And then we also have goods that are produced in the territory from originating materials. So this one's really important because, as you're going to see, that sometimes your goods will qualify for C. We'll leave it at that. But here is D, and D is the one I really want everybody to kind of keep not use. So the only time that this really works is when there's parts that are classified in the same tariff number as the finished article. And so this is really rare when you see something like this. There's very few tariff numbers that fall into this category. So, I just wanted to say that I would stay away from this number. If Customs sees D in any of these countries as a preference criteria, you're going to pique their interest. And so, as we talked about earlier, the meat of that agreement, 95% of it falls into B.
Preference criteria A, as Jim has told me, means if you use it improperly, means you're going to be audited. Because preference criteria A is for goods such as minerals, crops, live animals, things that come from the earth, things that come from the country. I can't tell you how many times in NAFTA that I have seen certificates being presented that had preference criteria A checked off on it. It isn't right unless it fits into one of those categories. And it's something that you should be careful of, because if you put it on there improperly, you will be audited. Preference criteria B is really, it is the meat of the agreement. Goods made entirely in the country, and the specific rule of origin has been satisfied. As I mentioned earlier, there are over 270 pages of rules. 95% of things that are going to qualify under preference criteria B. It's going to be either the tariff shift or the regional value content. And these are the things that we're going to talk about in much more detail going forward. The first step in qualifying your goods under NAFTA and under the USMCA is to determine the classification. This is the most important thing. All of the rules, 207 pages of them, are all predicated on what the classification of the item is. If you don't know how to classify a good, you're starting off behind the eight ball. There are the harmonized tariff number. The first two digits are the chapter. The first four digits are the heading. And then first six digits are the subheading. All of the rules are predicated on chapter, heading, and subheading. So you need to understand the tariff, and you need to understand how your goods change by regional value content or by tariff shift to meet those criteria. But I can't emphasize enough that the classification is the first step, and it must be done properly.
Jay, you bring up a great point here. And sometimes Canada Customs and Mexican Customs and CBP aren't always on an agreement on the harmonized tariff codes. So sometimes someone in Canada will actually have a ruling from their customs service saying that they have to classify their goods a certain way. And yet, in the U.S., customs may have issued a ruling saying to classify the goods another way. So sometimes it's not as clean cut as it looks, right? And so it may mean in some cases that you're going to need to qualify your goods using two different rules of origin just because of the way Canada Customs perceives the goods to be classified versus, U.S. Customs. So this is something that, sometimes, like you said, it can get very tricky. But most important is, like you said, it's a flaw if you're looking up the wrong rule of origin. Any way you look at it, it just puts you in a really bad spot. So we get this one all the time. Jay and I just love this slide because we hear this all the time, and it says, well, I have this much originating material, there's this much foreign content in it. My goods should qualify for the USMCA. It doesn't always depend that way. It really is going to come down to that rule of origin. And one of the winners on this thing was plastic articles that are in headings 3923 through 3926. In this case, we actually have one of my clients who does plastic garbage cans. They're actually ahead on this one right now. So now they're allowed to use non-originating resin to make this finished article and qualify it under the USMCA, where previously under the NAFTA, it required North American resin. So now, like I said, they can use 100% foreign content because of the relaxation of the rule of origin. So this is good news for somebody, the plastic industry in this case. So now we want to talk about how you're going to qualify your goods. So these agreements are designed in such a way, and they've been where they look at the specifics for that tariff number, and then say, look at, we believe that, this will be substantial to convert these goods. So it could be done by tariff shift. It could be done by a regional value content rule. It could be both. And as we talked about earlier today, certain commodities require additional requirements. So chemicals. So, so you're going to need to meet one of these scenarios. And as you're going to see coming up, we're going to show you how a pump could qualify.
One of the first criteria is the tariff shift. And again, it goes from one harmonized tariff number to the other. Therefore, if you don't know your harmonized tariff numbers, you can't even start this process. The shift must meet the requirements of the rule. The rule will be dependent on whether it is a heading, a chapter, or a subchapter. Goods that meet the tariff shift don't need to contain any originating material. For example, you can make something out of 5 different items that come from 5 different countries and make your good, and if your finished product is a different tariff number and the tariff shift rule is applicable, it'll qualify, even though there is no originating content from one of the USMCA countries. Some classifications in changing and getting the approval only have a tariff shift rule. The difference in what has happened under NAFTA and the USMCA is different. So you need to go back. I've had clients ask me, well, can I just take the NAFTA certificate, stamp it, and say it's now a USMCA certificate? Absolutely not. Some of the rules for tariff shift have been changed. some are the same. We had a situation that was a snowblower. I won't get into all the details. It was an 84-30-20, but it was a regional value situation in NAFTA. Now it's strictly a tariff shift. Makes the opportunity much greater to use that.
Great example, Jake. Great example.
Thanks, Jim. The tariff shift rule is very simple. You can see at the bottom, I won't read all the details there, but you're going, the rule says a change to heading 69, 08, 01 from any other heading. You're making a cup. You're making a ceramic cup. You're using the clay. The clay comes in for a foreign country, not a USMCA country. You've made the cup. The rule says it's gone through the tariff changed. This would be qualifying for duty-free treatment, even though all the raw material is non-originating.
We're going to talk about regional value content, and this is really important because as you're going to see that quite a few of your goods need to qualify under an RVC rule. So, we go through this periodically, Jay and I, where we'll ask someone to show us their bill of material. Did they do the math on the bill of material? And it's kind of quiet on the other end of the phone when you're talking to them. So, under RVC, we have transaction value. And that under other free trade agreements is known as billed down. Net cost, and that would be considered billed up under a lot of the other free trade agreements. The one important thing that I wanted to make sure everybody's aware of is some of the RVC thresholds have been updated. So actually, you'll see where some actually went down. Instead of requiring to be 60% transaction value and net cost of 50, they actually went down. There's a couple that actually went up. So you have to do your research and look through it. This is critical. So we're going to talk about transaction value first. And I felt bad for our marketing person because they're not really a math person. So when we tried to explain this to them, it was very confusing. But think about it this way. You're taking the sale price of your goods, adjusted to an FOB plant basis, and then you're going to take the value of the non-originating materials used to produce these goods, and then you're going to subtract them. And then you're going to divide them by the actual transaction value itself. And you're going to multiply that by 100. And that's going to give you your RVC. As you're going to see in one of the examples coming up, we actually have a lesser RVC amount, but it still qualifies. So this is something that's going to be really important that you have your math and you do it. I talked with the company on Friday about their cost, and they were very close to maybe not meeting it. So this is one of the important things that you have to be careful on right now is that you do meet your goods, you do meet that qualification. So let's talk about net cost method. So in many parts of the free trade agreement, your scenario, you might have something that's not a sale or it's a related party transaction. In that case, transaction value is not allowed, and that you need to use, under a related party or a no-sales scenario, a net cost, because otherwise you could fudge the number to get the right amount. And like I said, net cost, it's normally 50%, but there's some now out there that are 35%. So this is something that you're going to want to look at. And like I said, this is the build-up method. So you're basically taking that net cost of the good and then you're subtracting that non-originating material used by the producer in the production of that good. And then you're going to divide it by the net cost. And that, as you're going to see, multiplying by 100 is going to give you your RVC amount. If it meets the rule of origin, in this case 50%, you're going to qualify.
We had talked about the de minimis rule under Article 4.12, and it was changed under NAFTA from 7% to 10%, which is a plus. That means that now up to 10% of your goods can be non-originating, and you can still get credit for it. Most products are done by value, but textiles are done by weight. And again, as everything else in this world, there are exceptions to that. The next slide is an example.
Yep.
Of the de minimis rule. And what happens is this tariff number, a travel kit, is classified under 9605. And under the rule for 9605, you have to get a change to heading 9602 through 9605, which that is, from any other chapter. So everything to be qualified, and it's only a tariff change rule, in order to qualify this goods, everything must come out of another chapter. If you can look at the example, you have a couple of U.S. goods, and then you have some things coming from Taiwan. The toothbrush from Taiwan is in Chapter 96. That would disallow it, except if you applied the de minimis rule. If you did the math, which I did 3 times, if you took the 15% and added it up to the total of all of the materials, which is $1.55, you come out to 9%. So the toothbrush accounts for 99%, just 9%, of the total. Therefore, it is qualifying because it's less than the 10%. And as I mentioned earlier, under NAFTA, this would not qualify because under NAFTA, the de minimis rule was 7%.
Jay, that you got to admit, that's pretty amazing how impactful a change to the de minimis rule will help companies qualify their goods.
Oh, absolutely, and that's the reason, Jim, as we had talked about, that people have to look at all of the rules now because they'd have in their NAFTA certificate this product doesn't qualify. And then they can go and look through it and find out that now it does.
Yeah. How would you like to be one of these people that was disqualified and now all of a sudden you're able to complete that declaration? That's good news all the way around.
Very good news.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about intermediate materials. Intermediate materials were originally in the NAFTA agreement. And so under the scenario, it allows you to self-produce articles into an originating article. So let's just use the example of a heat exchanger part. So under that scenario, 84.19.91, you would take and have to look up that rule and make sure you met the rule of origin change to qualify the intermediate material. One of the things that they're saying now under this agreement is if you're going to use that intermediate material, it has to be incorporated into the finished good as well. And this is where, I know, Jay, you're probably think we're just beating this to death. We don't mean to, but so what happens in a case like this is if you have a regional value content rule, you have to look at it. So if your goods qualify under this intermediate material as self-produced, then you can count that as originating material for the good. If not, then you're going to have to deduct it as non-originating material in the whole process. So, like you said, like the NAFTA, it really depends on the rule of origin. We now have, this is very similar to the NAFTA rule again, too. So now you have conditions for accessories, spare parts, tools, and you're going to have situations where you may have expert belts and bags with a vacuum cleaner. Let's just use this as an example. So you buy a vacuum cleaner, and they say there's going to be a free bag in there and a free belt in there. Those could be offshore. As long as they're shipped in customary quantities and values, you're fine. But if they send you 2 cases of vacuum cleaner bags with your vacuum cleaner, that's not something that would be customary. The other thing that's important is sometimes that if your foreign goods that are going to go into this article, these spare parts or tools to assemble it, those could be subject to regional value content rule as well.
There are certain things that obviously don't confer origin onto a product. Simple things like dilution of the product with water, repackaging it, and more important, finagling your production and pricing practices to circumvent the rules, indicating there's more labor into it than really there is, those kinds of things. Obviously, those are no-nos, and they do not confer origin onto your product. You have to use the numbers that are accurate and depict exactly what's going on in your manufacturing operation. We're going to get into a few examples now of different things that qualify. And preference criteria C is goods that are produced entirely in the territory of one or more of the countries of exclusively originating material. And that's kind of a self-explanatory thing, except there's kind of an old double shift rule that comes across from NAFTA where, for example, you bring something into the country, it was imported from a foreign country, you manufacture that product, it goes through a tariff shift or regional value content and now becomes originating, and then you take that raw material and mix it with something else that was probably made in the United States, if we're talking in the United States. You put those together, and that's shipped out. So you really have products entirely in the territory of one of the countries, but the first one had come in and went through a shift to be able to be qualified. So you need to look at those kinds of things to make sure that you're adhering to the proper rules.
Nicely done, Jay. That's a complex rule to explain. Thank you.
You helped me with it, Jim. Thank you. What we're going to do now is get into a little bit of a workshop, and we're going to take a centrifugal pump, and we're going to run it through a couple of different scenarios, showing the different preference criteria to see if the thing qualifies or doesn't qualify. I think this is the meat of the presentation, to show you how things are done. The easiest thing is you take this centrifugal pump and you look at it, and all of the items either come from the United States, Mexico, or Canada. You make it. You then ship it to either the United States, Mexico, or Canada, wherever you're doing the manufacturing. And under Preference Criteria C that we just discussed, this qualifies. And that's an example of the pump. And we'll take a look now at different scenarios with the same pump to see how it might qualify or not qualify under some of the regional value or tariff shifts.
Awesome. Jay, thanks. So this example here where we have a pump that they've taken the bill of materials and they broke it down, and we got nuts and bolts and heading 7318 all the way through. But you're going to notice that we have a pump body and an impeller, and they actually classified these in 7326 as miscellaneous articles of metal. So if you look at it, so on face value, if you look at this rule in the in the left-hand corner, a change subheading 84.14.11 through 84.18, 84.13.82 from any other heading, this would look like it qualifies. However, this is a classic classification error. If you look at the body and the impeller, that's a classification error. You know, when you would look at it, you would know that a pump body and an impeller is considered part of an actual pump. So technically, it should have been 84.13 for that pump body and 84.13 for the impeller. Under that scenario, this doesn't qualify under the first rule. So, so what's going to happen next is we actually got to go and look at the bill of material. And when we start doing the details on this thing, you're going to notice that there's some articles from China, some from Korea, and so we're going to do the math on this thing and show you how it's broken down. So here we go. So here's our math on this one. And as you're going to see, we have $15.25 in non-originating material. And then we have a value of originating material at $43.50. The total cost of these goods is $58.75. And because we're selling it under transaction value, we have $75 in this situation. So let's do the math on this thing. So first things first, we're going to deduct the value of the non-originating materials from the transaction value. So here it is. We're deducting $15.25 from the 75. And then we're going to take that 75 and divide it into the 59.75, which gives us 79%, 79.66, times 100. So we actually have a good that is 79.66% originating content. So we need 60 or greater. Yes, this is going to qualify for the USMCA. And that's really, really important. I mean, so hopefully this example illustrates this. So now, let's take this scenario. So let's say that your purchasing person goes on a purchasing spree and doesn't buy a lot of goods in the North American countries, Mexico, Canada, and U.S., and they start sourcing these parts from overseas. And in this case, you actually have China, Germany, Korea, Malaysia, Taiwan, China, and India, right? So what does that do to the math on this thing? So here it is. So we have $58.75 in non-originating materials. And then, so we're going to take it and we're going to do the math on this. So we're going to subtract the $58.75, and that leaves us with $16.25 originating materials. And then we're going to divide it by 75 $5, right? And it gives us a formula of 2166. In this case, you need 60 or better. So no, this is not going to qualify for the USMCA.
This is another example of the regional value content calculation that Jim alluded to in the beginning of the presentation. If you look at the numbers here, you have a net cost of $5.05, and the non-originating material adds up from China, Taiwan, and India to $3.05. If you look at the bottom, this is one of the cases where it will qualify under the regional value content net cost method of 35%. So if you have in your head and you don't follow through and look at each rule, you would say, and we can look at the next slide, you would see that if you do the math, as Jim had outlined, you would see that you only have 39%. And on the surface, this item probably would not have qualified under NAFTA. But under the USMCA, this particular rule says if you have 35% or more under the net cost method, you do qualify. So this item would qualify.
Jay, one thing I did want to talk about net cost, and sometimes I'll hear clients say, well, we like transaction value, it's cleaner. However, we have some clients that require us to use net cost because we sell into the automotive as well. So my guidance to them is usually it might be better off just to qualify all your goods under net cost if you can. It'll save you doing two math problems. That's just my thought on this.
It's a good one.
Go ahead.
Where to find the origin procedures? We hit this in the beginning. General Note 11 doesn't exist, but you can find it under Annex 5A in the original agreement. We are going to get into this in quite a bit of detail in the next webinar on Wednesday, so we're not going to do any more on that at this point. The next steps. What do you do to make sure that you're going to be compliant and to make sure you're going to do it right? You have to review your classifications to ensure they're correct. You have to compare the rules under the USMCA to the rules that you did under NAFTA. They're not the same. I think we just indicated and showed you a few of those. Very important. You're going to have to be able to obtain certification to support your origin claims for materials or finished goods if you export them or if you import them. We've had cases where there was an audit. This was a good going to Canada. The Canadian government came back to audit the certificate that our client had presented and had gotten it from their supplier. And I won't bore you with all the details again, but there were some mistakes. It did not qualify. It was very embarrassing for our client. It was even more embarrassing for the supplier, who was no longer a supplier to that client, because they ran into trouble through the Canadian government, and rightfully so. It was done wrong. So it's very important that you make sure if you get a certification from your supplier that it is correct. And the other thing that's very important is you have to maintain your records. They'll come back after a while on an audit, and they'll say, okay, 5 years ago you did this, support what you presented. And again, we're going to get into the specific records that you have to maintain on Wednesday.
Thanks, Jay. I was going to say, I just went through this with someone recently. They just sent me their tariff numbers to look at, compared their USMCA rules against the NAFTA. And the first thing I saw was some of the stuff was misclassified. Customs has ruled on some of these articles and say they're specially named in the tariff here. So, like you said, the process will be flawed if they're not looking at that tariff classification from the beginning. Because then you're looking at the wrong rule of origin. And, so this is something that, we recommend for all exporters and importers. And then the one thing that I have seen quite a bit recently is everybody starting to reach out to their suppliers and asking for those certifications. So this is something that's going to be really important. Like you said, if you're going to need to attain them as an exporter, but there's also going to be other parties that you're selling to even domestically, that you're the producer of these goods, you're going to need to publish these right away. 30 days sounds like a long time, but it's coming quick.
Only 29 left. Sure.
And then, you and I talked about this. We put these helpful links up here. One of the things that was really interesting is the USMCA now has a help desk with CBP. And a Canadian company reached out to me about a week ago and said, I've looked at the rule of origin. My tariff number does not exist in the rule of origin. It was cut off. So maybe it was 84, 81, 41. They had 84, 81, 50. So they were so inside the rule of origin, it didn't exist. So they actually reached out to Customs and said, what rule of origin do I follow for my product because it's not named in the specific rule of origin? The one that I was going to mention is that USMCA Interim Implementing Instructions. It's a great read in that it's easy to read. I'm sure it will be changing. Customs has today, they actually will have another webinar today as well with updates. And I have someone from my team actually looking at what Customs is going to say regarding General Note 11, regarding 520D claims, for recovering MPF. So there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be changing still, as we mentioned earlier, and we'll keep you updated.
As Jim was talking, I was looking at my watch, and I think we did it, Jim.
I know we did really well.
All right, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jim and Jay, for conducting today's presentation. We appreciate you volunteering to cover the content today. It was very well received. I know, we wanted to pack this information into 1 hour. I just want to conclude with a note or two. I got a ton of good questions that came in. I know we stated it early in the presentation if folks got in a minute or two late that we weren't going to take questions today. But we have plenty of time for questions on Wednesday. So that was our plan going into this, and it was in their email that you should have received this morning regarding the webinar today. So we will take those questions. So just hold those questions for Wednesday. I think we're going to have about, 30 minutes. I think the content that Jim and Jay are going to cover is going to take about 30 minutes on Wednesday on the documentation side, and then we're going to allow 30 minutes for Q&A. Again, we are going to send out I got a ton of these questions regarding the presentation. We're going to send out an email Thursday morning by 9 a.m. so it gives time for the second webinar for the recording to be completed. We'll get an email out with the resource materials from Jay and Jim, as well as links to the net replay that you can access. You can share it with colleagues as well. So we'll get that information out. And again, I just want to thank you all for dialing in today. Thank you, Jim and Jay, for your presentation, and that'll conclude today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Once again, that does conclude today's call. Thank you all for participating. You may disconnect your lines at this time.